What's going on, YouTube? We're back at it for another video, and today we've got the new best guns inside of Helldivers 2, as well as talking about those poor balance changes that came with the escalation of freedom. We will be doing some videos later on talking about, or basically reviewing, the escalation of freedom's injection of content, which was the large portion of the update that was supposed to be the best part of it, but sadly enough it seems as though they've gone to old routine ways of their balancing, and it is not sitting very well with me or a lot of the community. But we'll be talking about that a little bit later on, giving you the alternative weapons that you'll need in order to replace some of those that may have been nerfed into the ground, or at least in certain situations as well. And I will be doing a tier list video for all the primary weapons and support weapons later on this week, so be sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more of that Helldivers 2 content coming in the future, as well as loadouts breakdown for the Super Helldive and a bit of that solo action. With that being said, we've got more than a few things to cover, so let's get straight into it. Starting off first with the new S tier weapon that everybody's talking about, the COOKOUT, coming with the Flames of Freedom. This is definitely something that would more than likely entice a lot of people in order to buy up the Flames of Freedom War Bond. It is the Punisher shotgun. It's almost indistinguishable at first, as the damage did feel quite similar after using the Punisher again after the COOKOUT, though. I will say that the Punisher does have a little bit more damage output, so if you don't have the Flames of Freedom War Bond, right now the Punisher is also going to be an S tier weapon. I've loved this weapon since the beginning of the game, and ever since they introduced its increased damage as well as the stagger factor with this, it is an absolute powerhouse, and the COOKOUT seems to be doing just as fine as the Punisher was, if not a little bit better, especially when it comes to facing off with the TERMINID, considering we've got that new incendiary effect on top of it, giving you the capability of pelting a couple of those enemies at distance and allowing that burn effect to finish them off without needing to waste more shells. But on top of that, just having the stagger alongside this is going to make it an absolute S tier weapon, as it will give you the capability of pushing back those new and improved brood commanders that have that double health. You'll be able to push back the enemies that you'll be facing off with, stopping those bloody bugs from vomiting and giving yourself a little bit of breathing room in certain situations where you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, especially on Super Helldive. But it doesn't end there, as it will also be pretty powerful against the automatons, considering it does have the same stagger effect. The Punisher, yet again, was a very powerful weapon to use against the automatons, considering even just one pellet from any one of your shells could end up staggering any one of those devastators. You'll be able to bully them now, and the better portion of having the COOKOUT with the incendiary damage is that burning effect will also further decrease the accuracy of any one of those devastators. So if you're in that moment where you need to reload, or you don't have line of sight on that devastator right after you've shot them with the COOKOUT, their next shots will be something that could possibly miss you, or possibly have a decreased chance of dealing damage towards you or the rest of your teammates. Beyond that, though, I would say this is something that is better suited for facing off with the TERMINID. Coming up right after that, when it comes to the new best guns inside of Helldivers 2, we've got the CRISPR, the P72. This thing is actually quite insane, and it does add a little bit of that crowd control capability. I wouldn't necessarily use this against the automatons, but I would say this can be an S tier secondary when it comes to facing off with the TERMINID. One of the biggest reasons for this is the simple fact that it is a one-handed weapon. You can literally start running away and then spraying the ground with the CRISPR, lighting it all on fire, allowing you to basically train some of those enemies, especially hunters or some of those smaller enemies, into that fire. As they crawl through it, they'll start to stack up that damage on top of them, or at the same time, if you got some bigger type of enemies, lighting that ground on fire with something like this is not only going to affect those smaller enemies, but the medium type enemies, giving you the capability of moving away while applying some damage over time, and then being able to finish them off with your primary weapon, making life a whole lot easier in certain situations, especially after a bug breach, and allowing you to just add a little bit of that flame damage or burning damage at any given moment with that secondary. It may not be perfect for every situation, but it is dealing quite a bit of damage, and it does add a little bit of that crowd control factor to just about any type of build, especially if you're somebody that just never uses your secondary. This could be something to help out in certain situations, especially if you have a full loadout that's all about anti-armor and not a whole lot of crowd control. Throwing this in could help quite a bit for you. Coming up right after that, we've got the SLUGGER, which originally was one of the better weapons inside of Helldivers 2 previously, until the devs decided to make a very stupid decision to take away the stagger of this weapon, which made no sense, especially after reading their explanation of their nerfs and balancing for this recent patch, and at the bottom, them talking about the commando not being intended to blow up the fabricators from any different direction. So they've decided that they're not going to change that just yet. They will be nerfing it in the future, but as for right now, they're looking into ways that they can change it that doesn't basically impede the weapon. which is something they definitely should have done when it came down to the Slugger, as originally this was something that was considered to be the best sniper in the game. So because they failed to change the ballistics to what they intended the weapon to be in the game, they decided to basically nerf it into the ground, make it completely unviable, and give us less options available to us while playing for the past few months until they finally fixed the ballistics on this weapon with this recent update, and then reintroduced a stagger. At this point is just a good bit of stupidity on their part for this type of change to this weapon, and for the most part, this should have been something that was left in the game, and then later on they reintroduced the changes to the ballistics to give it a little bit more drop and something that was closer to a medium range to close range type of weapon, instead of making it into the sniper it should have been, which really does say something about the marksman rifles. I'll be honest, we need a marksman rifle that's very closely related to the Slugger, that has the same stagger level, maybe a little bit of an increase to its overall fire rate, but something that feels like a really good bolt-action sniper rifle and not as slow as something as the Eruptor. But that's my personal opinion. But now that the Slugger is back, this is an absolute S-tier weapon when it comes to facing off with the automatons. It was something that would be able to one-shot any one of the Devastators if you were able to get that shot onto the weak spot in the dead center, or any time that you were able to face off close with any one of those Devastators, you'd be able to bully them into submission and just toss them to the ground. Now, it may not have the full crazy amount of damage that you'd like it to have when it comes to taking out Devastators, but if you can get up close and personal and be able to get that one shot into the dead center, especially while actually staggering them, it can be pretty beneficial, and it can be a good bit of fun. It's definitely a weapon that I've missed, and I'm greatly enjoying picking this back up and throwing it in to any one of my automaton matches. Now, I had people in the past on certain videos comment that they like to use this for the Terminid. I'm not a big fan of it. I don't think it's great for crowd control, but it does still have that stagger effect. It does have medium armor penetration, and if it's something that suits your fancy, by all means, throw it into that loadout. Now, coming up right after that, we've got the poor balance changes that ended up happening with this update, starting off with the Breaker Incendiary. Now, they did reduce its capabilities when it comes down to its overall ammo capacity. When it comes to ammo economy, this has really been pushed into the ground. If you do not have a supply backpack, or if you're not constantly dropping those supply drops in order to maintain that ammunition throughout the match, you're going to find yourself on empty quite often. And I find this to be extremely irritating, as this is one of those moments where previous to this update I also had issues with ammo economy on this weapon beforehand. Even when there was 6 different mags with this instead of just 4, there would be a lot of different times where I would completely deplete myself and it wouldn't feel overpowered. That was the most irritating portion of them making this change, because there's a lot of other weapons that would do a whole lot better if they increased the total ammunition capacity per magazine, especially when it comes to the ARs. But instead of doing something like that type of change to increase the viability of other weapons to bring them in line with the Breaker Incendiary, they've decided they're going to kneecap the Breaker Incendiary to force you in different directions of using other different weapons, which in this case, it seems as though shotguns are going to reign the king when it comes down to the best guns inside of Helldivers 2, or at least for right now. But let's talk about some of the alternative options if you're not fancy in the Breaker Incendiary anymore, and if you're not rocking that supply backpack with grenade launcher combo, that loadout is going to be fantastic with the Breaker Incendiary still. We'll be making some videos on that later on, so hit that subscribe button. But when it comes down to the other 2 weapons that would be closely related to this and give you a little bit of that same crowd control effect, the first weapon being the original Breaker, this one is still going to be fantastic even though they've reduced its capacity per magazine down by 2. It has absolute massive power when it comes down to its overall damage output, almost rivaling that of the Punisher, but at the same time having way more of that fire rate, giving you a little bit more viability when it comes to facing off with those new types of brood commanders, and it can also be used against the automatons, so that's one thing to be said. But in my opinion, the best option if you're looking for something very similar to the Breaker Incendiary that's actually going to have unlimited ammo, a good bit of that crowd control, and also be decent at taking out those medium type enemies, including the bloaty bugs as well as the new brood commanders pretty efficiently, the Arc 12 Blitzer is going to be it. With this update, they did have a buff to the arc weapons to where they're not getting stuck on certain objects, or they're not constantly just hitting foliage or dead bodies. They're actually consistently being able to arc to multiple different enemies even while there are large portions of dead bodies in front of you. Here and there will still be some moments where it does arc to dead bodies, but it is much more consistent, and it is much more consistent with the Arc 12 Blitzer to actually be hitting multiple enemies now, and it is a highly viable weapon, especially against the Terminid. Wouldn't say it's too great against the automatons just yet. It's something you could take in, but against the Terminid, the Blitzer is now fully in an S tier position when it comes to facing off with them. And I would highly suggest picking this one up if you're not a fan of the Breaker Incendiary at this point, and hopefully they will restore the Breaker Incendiary to its former glory. Now, coming up right after that, they did make a change to the CB9 exploding crossbow. I'll be honest, this thing is still just dead in the water. They made it to where now it is just one-handed, which gives it a little bit of a quality of life change. You can use this with a ballistic shield against the automatons now, but by all means, it is still nowhere near what it used to be, and it is pretty much still something I would consider unviable. I'm not a big fan of the ballistic shield in the first place. I still find it to be one of the most useless stratagems in the game. It's more of a roleplay element. As soon as you face off with anything with a multitude of rockets, it almost feels as though it becomes counterintuitive to you, and at that same point you'd be better off using something like the Pummeler or the Defender with that ballistic shield rather than the exploding crossbow, considering it's still going to take 4 rounds out of the only 5 you have per magazine with the exploding crossbow. It has a very slow rate of fire, and just taking out Devastators with this is not very efficient, and you take away some of the capability of precision aim with the exploding crossbow, especially if you go into first person with that ballistic shield. It is very difficult to land those shots properly, and there is no laser on it. But overall, when it comes down to the exploding crossbow, they are going to need to bring back the blast radius with this for it to be something even more viable than what it is right now, and even then that would be something that would be more in line with just making it better towards the Terminid than it would be against the automatons. I don't understand where they were going with this one. I know they were trying to make it a little bit more interesting and a bit more versatile with the options you could use the exploding crossbow, but honestly, I mean, the most that you're getting out of this is the capability of shooting this over your shoulder while running away from something, or using it with a ballistic shield, which basically doesn't change any of the negative aspects to this weapon. Now, coming up right after that, we did get a stealth nerf when it comes to the Flamethrower. We are no longer capable of completely melting down any one of those chargers by hitting them in the leg, as they did change the overall functioning or realism of fire within the game. Maybe a unpopular opinion, but I will say I thought this was coming. I knew this was coming in a way. It just felt completely broken, especially with how fast we would take down chargers by just aiming this at their kneecap. It was a bit ridiculous. It was like less than 1/4 of the canister in certain moments. It was just killing things way too fast. But I did not expect them to outright completely destroy its capability. I don't even feel as though you can get up behind one of those chargers and hit them directly in the weak spot with the Flamethrower right now. And maybe it's me or a placebo effect of just not being able to kill chargers, but I do not feel as though the actual crowd control function of the Flamethrower works as viably as it used to. It doesn't feel as though it's igniting the enemies as well as it used to, or at least giving that strong capability of just burning through crowds anymore. And I don't know whether or not that's because it's now interacting with light and medium armor in a different way that's diminishing its total damage output. That could be possible. But let me know down in the comments below if you're feeling the same way about the Flamethrower. Coming up right after that, we did get a stealth buff to the anti-material rifle and the railgun. Now, the stealth buff that came to both of these weapons is going to be for the automatons, and this is towards gunships specifically. More specifically, when it comes down to taking them down by shooting them in the engine. Now, the railgun and the anti-material rifle only take 3 shots to 1 engine. In order to take down one of those, it's going to be a lot easier to get it done with the anti-material rifle, and I'd say the anti-material rifle is 100% an S-tier support weapon for the automatons right now, and it just makes it so much easier to take down a multitude of gunships with this weapon as compared to the railgun, which the railgun, the biggest reason it's going to be difficult to get those 3 shots every time, and this is in safe mode as well. You only need 3 shots from safe mode to take down one of these gunships, but the scope on the railgun is still trash. You don't get that same zoom you get with the anti-material rifle, but at the same time, the railgun is doing fantastic against a lot of different enemies, including the Hulks and those new Striders that are fully armored. But overall, the railgun was a very powerful weapon to use against the automatons, and one of its biggest drawbacks was the simple fact that it really couldn't even take down a gunship, and it's nice that it can now, but it's still not as easy. I wish we could change the scope on this in the coming future, or possibly have a way to change it to have a little bit of zoom, considering it's supposed to be some type of high-powered sniper rifle. So hopefully that's a fix in the future, but thankfully they have addressed this issue, as I've had a huge issue with the gunships in this game, considering it's basically support weapons, and then I think 2 of the sentries that have the capability of taking down gunships. There's not one stratagem, not even the orbital laser goes after them. And at the end of the day, a lot of people would only use the laser cannon or the auto cannon in order to effectively take down each one of these gunships. So it's nice to see the anti-material rifle and the railgun and a few other weapons have a little bit easier time at taking down these gunships now that they've actually diminished the total armor on each one of the engines. But that's basically the only buff that we got with this entire update, which is ridiculous. Because I don't consider the Slugger getting its stagger back to be an actual buff. I feel like that's just correcting an error that they had previously. And coming up last, just to talk about it, the Flame 66 Torture is just something you shouldn't use. It's flat out just bad. It's a worse version of the Flamethrower. It doesn't do great. It slows you down when you fire it. It's not going to be melting anything. It's not really catching the ground on fire. Honestly, I haven't really seen any viable option for this just yet, other than just being an idiot and throwing it into your loadout, trying to be a full-on Flame Pyromancer build, which by all means, you know, have your fun with it, but for right now, this just feels terrible to me. But let me know how you feel about it down in the comments below. But that's going to be it right there. That's going to be the new best guns inside of Helldivers 2. That's going to be those updated balance changes that just seem to get worse with certain updates. The last updates seemed pretty great. The balancing they did with that, with the sentries, and made things better. You know, it felt like it was going in the right direction. And now it seems we've pulled a full 180, as well as just introducing a lot of good content. The worst part is they did inject quite a bit of content into the game that actually functions and isn't complete garbage, in my opinion. And then they basically put hot garbage on top of it with the balancing changes that they did with this update, especially when it comes to introducing a new higher difficulty. Makes no sense why they would start nerfing some of these weapons at that point. But who knows what they're doing. I'll be talking about a little bit more in depth when it comes down to what they were thinking with each one of these changes, or just making some type of notes on what I think they should make changes to in the coming future when it comes down to primary weapons. We will have a primary weapon tier list and support weapon tier list coming in the future, so hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more content coming in the future, as well as some of those super Helldive loadouts. But let me know down in the comments below how you're feeling about some of these changes. What are your new favorite primary weapons to use as of right now? You know, if you've changed off from the Incendiary Breaker, let me know what your choice of weapon is from this point going forward. Or at least, you know, let me know whether or not you've stopped playing the game entirely because you're that frustrated with this update. I know some people have that feeling. And I'll be honest, if we don't start getting some major orders that start progressing this overall war campaign, or getting some updates that kind of revert some of these changes, I will find myself in different games very quickly. But that being said, we still got a lot of content to get done, so if you'd like to see more of this content in the future, hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to see some of this content live, hit that link down in the description below. Follow me over at Twitch. We'll be streaming daily. And on that note, have a good one.